Hi there. In this short video, we're going to take a quick look at what we mean by a concept called strategic drift. Now, of course, just like every one of us, a business can lose direction. It can drift off course. And that essentially is the idea behind a concept called strategic drift. It's not something that's easy to measure. It's more of a concept that helps explain why some previously successful businesses appears to lose their way. So let's take a look at the idea. In terms of a definition, strategic drift happens when the strategy of a business is no longer relevant or suitable to the challenges of the external environment facing it, the opportunities and the threats. In other words, something happens to the business, which means that it drifts off course, often over a fairly long period of time, not necessarily overnight. And as a consequence, it suddenly finds that it's lost its way. Now, this can be illustrated, but don't forget this is purely conceptual. There isn't really any kind of data or evidence that might be able to help us map a business that suffers from strategic drift, but it's essentially around trying to explain the process that takes place. How does a business suddenly find itself having drifted off course? Well, the starting point for this is to explain that the external environment for a business is always changing, constantly changing. So in this diagram on the screen there, the external environment as measured by the amount of change is shown as the blue line. That's the external environment that changes over time. Now, of course, what businesses try to do is they try to step by step amend and vary their strategy to take account of the change in the external environment. And that's illustrated there by those 4 small steps in strategy, a process called incremental change. Just making small changes as we go, picking up on the opportunities and threats. And by the end of phase 1, we're still pretty much in touch, aren't we, with the change line. However, the next period is where things start to go wrong. The process of strategic drift. The business is still making those small incremental changes, but what it's failed to notice somehow is that the change has got bigger or more significant, and the gap between where the business is and where it needs to be if it was to follow the change line is getting bigger and bigger. That is what we mean by strategic drift, or the business being slowly finding itself off course. Then it gets to the third phase called flux, where it's spotted that there is an issue, that it's out of touch with the environment, with the external environment, and it fluctuates or flux, the process of flux, trying to respond in some way, first one way, then another, but still not quite closing the gap between where it needs to be, which is on the blue line. Finally, phase 4 of strategic drift involves a significant decision. Do you make some transformational changes to the business? So you can see how this model is very closely linked to change management. For example, do you bring in a new CEO, perhaps a new external CEO with a fresh perspective, who sees what the business needs to do to realign it with the external environment? In which case they would follow that red line there, a sudden, sharp, transformational change, not without pain, of course, but getting the business back to alignment with the external environment. Or does the business suddenly find that it's dead? It can't respond. It's simply allowed itself to drift for too long, and it can't be transformed. And often, of course, you might argue that businesses that die, businesses that fail, are usually, when you look back at their history, there's something long-term about the business that has gone wrong, and it can be explained in some ways by the concept of strategic drift. So there we go. That's the concept illustrated in a nice chart. As I say, there isn't really any data out there that shows precisely that process taking place, but of course it can help explain why some previous market-leading businesses suddenly find themselves either needing transformational change or facing business failure. So why does this take place? Well, of course, the external environment is changing a lot, and in many cases, the external environment is becoming even more dynamic. Perhaps the best example of that, if we were to use the PESTLE framework, is the technological environment, where the pace of change, the rapid development, in particular, of digital technologies is changing the opportunities and threats facing many businesses and industries. Another reason why drift takes place is that complacency sets in. It's often said that a market leader, particularly dominant market leaders, believe they can do no wrong. Why shouldn't what has worked before continue to work? The management, the business, the senior team become complacent based around their confidence on previous success. And of course, there can also be a process of denial going on, where the senior management team simply deny that there's a problem, or their measurement systems, their radar isn't sufficiently tuned to spot these significant changes in the external environment. So let's just look at 2 or 3 examples of strategic drift just to help illustrate this concept. Perhaps the classic, perhaps the most significant and certainly widely known example of strategic drift that's usually quoted in the textbooks is that of Kodak. Kodak used to have something like 95% of the global market for processing film for cameras. And it actually did have some technology to make it a leader in digital photography. But it decided that wasn't going to be a significant opportunity and ditched it. And of course, the rest is history. Kodak eventually filed for bankruptcy. 2 more recent examples, of course, Nokia, which used to be the global market leader in mobile phones, in particular what was known as feature phones, i.e. not smartphones. It had 45-50% of the global market, but it failed to respond to the significant developments in smartphone technology, and as a result, lost its position. And thirdly, what about social media? I know most of us are all on Facebook and Snapchat, but there was a time when MySpace was the global market leader in social media. However, it failed to respond to customer use, particularly younger customer use. Facebook was able to respond much better to the opportunities and the changing requirements, the changing technological and social requirements of users. And as a result, MySpace eventually failed as a business. There we go. That's an overview of the concept of strategic drift.